When the instructor walked into the classroom that morning, everyone could tell something special was about to happen. The Mixed Species Training Academy was usually noisy, full of different voices and different tempers. But that day, as soon as the instructor placed a long wooden box on the front table, the room slowly fell quiet. Students leaned forward, curious. Some even stood a little taller, their ears or horns twitching with interest. Inside the box were several small tools, a few stones, and a couple of scraps of metal. Nothing too impressive, yet the way the instructor rested his hand on the lid hinted that the task ahead was important. He observed the class carefully before speaking. "For your next exam," he said, "you will each create a blade." A soft wave of excitement moved through the room. The orc students grinned proudly, already imagining the heavy tools they would swing. The dwarves straightened their belts, confident in their crafting skills. The elf students exchanged calm smiles, knowing they had experience with delicate shaping and precision. Even some of the beast folk whispered to one another about magical materials they could use. But one student, a human girl named Lyra, felt her stomach tighten. She wasn't weak or afraid. She simply knew she lacked the advantages everyone else had. She didn't come from a family of metalworkers. She had no natural magic to help shape enchanted ore. She didn't have the physical strength of the orcs or the refined instincts of the elves. She was, compared to most of her classmates, painfully ordinary. Still, Lyra listened carefully as the instructor continued. "You may choose any material," he said. "Metal, crystal, stone, wood. Whatever you believe you can shape into a working blade. You may work alone or in small groups, but your final piece must be your own creation." The orcs immediately started boasting about who would forge the biggest blade. The dwarves discussed which ores they would melt first. The elves debated whether to use moonstone or spirit glass. Even some younger beast folk talked excitedly about carving blades infused with nature magic. Lyra sat quietly, thinking. She had tried using metal in earlier lessons, but she struggled to hammer it evenly. Her hands were steady, but not strong. The tools felt heavy to her, and metal never behaved the way she wanted. Using magical materials wasn't an option either. She didn't have enough skill for that dot as the class broke apart into groups and headed toward the workshop. Lyra stayed behind a moment longer. She walked up to the instructor, hoping maybe she could get some advice. "Sir," she said softly, "what if someone doesn't have a good material in mind yet?" The instructor looked at her kindly. "Then that someone should spend more time observing the world," he replied. "The best material is not always the strongest one. Sometimes it is the material that matches the maker." His words didn't give her a clear answer, but they gave her something better permission to explore. Lyra left the workshop and walked out into the academy grounds. The others were already busy melting metal, polishing crystals, and preparing their workspaces. She could hear the first clangs of heavy hammers from the forge room. She could smell burning coal. She could see sparks flying from metal as orc students hammered confidently. It all made her feel very small, but she didn't let the feeling stop her. Instead of returning to join them, she took a deep breath and walked toward the forest behind the academy. The trees there were old and tall, their leaves whispering in the gentle breeze. Small birds flew between the branches, and sunlight filtered through in soft golden patches. Lyra liked this place. It was quiet, and the air felt cleaner. She hoped maybe she would find inspiration here, something different from the metal and magic everyone else was using. As she walked along a narrow path, she took her time, letting her eyes wander. She looked at the shapes of fallen branches, wondering if wood could be shaped into a blade. But wood wasn't strong enough, not for the exam. She examined rocks along the ground, but they were bulky and difficult to work with. After nearly an hour, she was starting to feel discouraged. Maybe she really didn't belong in a place where everyone else seemed so gifted. Maybe humans weren't meant to compete with elves, dwarves, and orcs in crafting. Then she noticed something unusual under a layer of leaves near an old tree. A pale curve, smooth and almost glossy. She knelt down and brushed away the leaves. What she uncovered was a large bone, probably from an animal that had passed away long ago. It was long, strong, and surprisingly well preserved. She lifted it carefully. It was lighter than stone, but sturdier than wood. The surface had a natural curve, almost like it wanted to become something. For the first time that day, Lyra felt a spark of hope. She studied the bone more closely. The edges were thick, but not too thick to shape. The texture was solid, not brittle. She remembered reading once that early humans used bone tools and weapons before metal was common. Those tools worked because people learned how to shape bone with patience and technique. Maybe she could do the same, but doubt crept in quickly. What would her classmates say if she walked into the workshop carrying a piece of bone? They already teased her for not choosing metal. They would probably laugh and wonder why she was picking something so simple when others were using rare crystals and enchanted materials. Still, the bone felt right in her hands, and the instructor's words echoed in her mind. The best material is the one that matches the maker. She decided to trust herself. Lyra wrapped the bone in a cloth and carried it back toward the academy. On the way, she imagined what it might become. She pictured shaping it smoothly, carving designs into it, polishing it until it shined. She didn't know exactly how to do all of that yet, but she was willing to learn. When she entered the workshop, the noise hit her again. Hammering, shouting, bursts of magic, clattering tools. Students turned to look at her, and some chuckled when they saw what she carried. "That's a bone," one dwarf student said with a confused expression. "You're joking, right?" An orc student added, laughing. An elf student raised an eyebrow and whispered to a friend, "How is that going to pass the exam?" Lyra felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment, but she didn't respond. She simply walked to an empty corner of the workshop and placed the bone gently on her table. She took a deep breath, calming her nerves. The instructor approached her a moment later. He looked at the bone, then at her, and gave a small approving nod. "Unusual choice," he said. "But unusual does not mean wrong. Do you think it can work?" Lyra asked quietly. "It can," he replied. "But bone requires patience. You will need time, care, and steady hands. If you're willing to work hard, it may surprise you." That was enough for her. As the instructor walked away, Lyra rolled up her sleeves and prepared her tools. She knew that shaping bone wouldn't be easy. She knew her classmates already thought she would fail. But she also knew something else she wanted to try. She wanted to see if she could turn something simple into something beautiful. The thought filled her with a quiet determination. She picked up the bone, held it firmly, and began her first careful scrape, ready to start a journey that no one else in the room expected her to succeed at. But in her heart, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the belief that she could create something worthwhile, something meaningful, something uniquely her own. And that belief, even if small, was enough to begin. Lyra returned to the workshop early the next morning, long before the usual noise and crowd filled the place. She wanted a quiet moment before everyone else arrived, a moment where she didn't have to hear comments or see confused looks about her strange choice of material. The bone lay on her work table, wrapped in cloth just as she had left it. When she unwrapped it, the morning light coming through the window made its pale surface glow softly. She touched it with her fingertips. The bone felt cool and smooth, but strong. It had a natural shape that almost seemed like it had been waiting to be carved, waiting for someone to notice it. Lyra felt a little comfort in that thought. Maybe she hadn't made the wrong choice after all. She took a small carving tool and made her first light cut along the surface. The sound was soft, nothing like the heavy metal scraping or the loud ringing of hammers that the other students produced. It felt peaceful. With each small stroke, the bone took on a slightly different shape. She wasn't trying to make it perfect, yet she was simply learning how it reacted, how deep she could scrape, how much pressure it needed. A little later, the door of the workshop opened, and the other students began arriving. As they walked past her station, a few couldn't help peeking at what she was doing. One orc student paused and raised an eyebrow. "Still working on that bone?" he asked, not unkindly but clearly puzzled. Lyra nodded. "Yes, I'm trying to figure out the best way to shape it." He shrugged, gave a half-smile, and went off to his own table where he immediately began hammering metal loudly. The sound made the entire workshop vibrate. A pair of elf students passed next. One of them glanced at her work and said quietly, "It's unusual, but unusual things sometimes become interesting." The other elf simply gave her a polite nod. Lyra appreciated that they didn't laugh or judge her as harshly as some others had. Still, she kept her focus on her work, trying not to absorb too much from anyone's reaction, good or bad. After a while, the instructor entered and walked around the workshop, checking on everyone. When he reached Lyra, he watched her, carving for a moment. "You are learning the material," he said. "That is good. Bone is honest. It doesn't respond well to rushing." "I noticed," she said with a small smile. "If I press too hard, it cracks." "Exactly. It rewards patience." Then he continued to the next students, leaving Lyra feeling a little more confident. However, as the day went on, the challenges became clearer. The bone dust sticking to her hands made them dry and itchy. Her fingers began to ache from holding the carving tools for so long. At one point, she slipped, and a thin piece of bone splintered off. Her heart sank. She thought she had ruined the entire piece. But after taking a few deep breaths, she realized the damage wasn't as bad as she feared. She adjusted the shape slightly and kept going. It was far from easy, but she wasn't ready to give up. By midday, she needed a break. So she wiped her hands, stepped outside, and sat on a bench near the workshop doors. The sun was warm on her skin, and the fresh air helped her relax. While she sat there, she overheard some students talking nearby. Why would she choose bone? One asked. "It's weak," another replied. "She never passed the exam." Lyra felt a sting in her heart, but she also felt something unexpected, a small spark of determination. Their doubt almost pushed her forward instead of pulling her down. She wanted to show them that strength didn't always come from the material itself. Sometimes it came from the person shaping it. After resting for a few minutes, she went back inside. She gathered more tools from the supply shelves, small files, different carving tips, a polishing cloth. Some were unfamiliar to her, but she figured she could learn as she went. Trial and error had become her silent teacher. While she carved, she remembered something her grandmother once told her when she was a child. Human hands may not be the strongest, but they can be careful, clever, and full of heart. Lyra had never taken those words seriously before, but now, working on something as delicate as bone, the memory felt meaningful. Hours passed. The bone slowly changed shape, edges becoming smoother, curves becoming more defined. Lyra kept pausing to check the balance. She held it lightly, imagining how it might look once finished. She could almost see the blade forming, even though it was still far from ready. Every time she grew frustrated, she reminded herself why she chose this material. Not because she wanted to stand out, not because she wanted attention, but because it felt right, like something she could give her time and effort without fear of failure. Bone wasn't simple. It wasn't weak. It held history, life, and memory. and she liked the idea of turning something old and forgotten into something useful and beautiful again not later in the afternoon. While Lyra was deeply focused, the instructor stopped by again. He picked up the bone carefully, examined it from several angles, and put it back down. "You're making good progress," he said. "Thank you," she replied quietly. "Remember," he added, "bone reacts well to heat, but too much heat will ruin it. When you reach the shaping stage, use a controlled flame." Lyra nodded, soaking in every word. After he walked away, she considered her next steps. She knew she wasn't ready for heat shaping yet. She still needed to refine the overall form. But she kept the instructor's advice in mind for later. By the end of the day, while most students were proudly showing off shiny pieces of metal and glowing crystal blades taking shape, Lyra had something far simpler on her table, a bone slowly beginning to resemble a blade. It wasn't shiny, it wasn't magical, but it was hers, shaped by steady hands and patient effort. When the workshop closed for the day, Lyra wrapped the bone again and took it with her. She didn't want to leave it there, where others might touch it or move it without understanding how fragile it was. As she walked through the academy courtyard, she felt tired, but in a good way, the kind of tiredness that came from doing meaningful work. Instead of going straight to her room, she stopped by the library. She knew she needed more knowledge, maybe. There were old books about crafting with bone or natural materials. She searched through shelves for a long time until she found something promising. A thin book about early human tools and survival methods. It wasn't a crafting manual, but it described how bone could be shaped using heat, stone, and certain types of oils to strengthen it. She borrowed the book and read a few pages on her walk back. The information was simple but helpful. It made her feel like she wasn't completely guessing anymore. That night, in her small dorm room, she placed the bone on the desk and looked at it while she read more. The moonlight from her window shone on its surface, giving it a soft glow. It looked almost alive, as if it had a story of its own waiting to be told. She carefully ran her fingers along the edges she had carved earlier. They were uneven, and she still had a long way to go, but she was beginning to understand the material more with every passing hour. Before going to sleep, she wrapped it again and placed it beside her bed, feeling strangely protective of it. She didn't know if she would succeed or fail in the end, but she knew one thing clearly. She was learning more than just how to craft a blade. She was learning how to trust herself, how to listen to her instincts even when others doubted her, and how to turn something simple into something extraordinary. And deep down, she felt that her unusual choice this piece of bone was going to lead her somewhere unexpected, something bigger than an exam grade. It was only the beginning, and she couldn't help but feel a quiet excitement for what tomorrow would bring. The next morning, when Lyra walked back into the workshop, she felt a small flutter of nervous excitement in her chest. The bone was tucked safely under her arm, wrapped in soft cloth like something precious. She had spent half the night reading and thinking about how to shape it better, and now she was ready to try again. The workshop was already buzzing with noise. Sparks flew from the forge where the orc students hammered metal with loud confidence. The dwarves worked in a focused, steady rhythm, shaping their blades with sturdy tools. The elf students sat at neat tables, using fine instruments to carve elegant details into glowing materials. Everyone looked so skilled, so sure of what they were doing. Lyra found her corner, unwrapped the bone, and took a deep breath before beginning again. At first, the work felt smooth and familiar. She scraped the surface lightly, just as she had practiced. But after a short while, she realized something new. The deeper she carved, the harder the bone became. Its inner layers were not as simple to shape as the outer ones. It resisted her tools in a way she hadn't expected. She pressed harder, and suddenly crack. A thin split formed along one side. Her heart dropped. For a moment she froze. staring at the crack. It wasn't big, but it was enough to make her worry. She ran her thumb lightly across it. The bone wobbled a little, almost as if warning her to be more careful. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She reminded herself that mistakes didn't mean failure. They just meant she needed to learn. After calming herself, she picked up a smaller carving tool and tried to smooth the cracked area, shaving off tiny pieces at a time. Slowly, the split became less noticeable. But even after she fixed it, she felt the weight of doubt pressing on her shoulders. Around her, the other students seemed to be progressing much faster. The orcs were shaping big, heavy blades that sparkled orange from the forge. The dwarves had already formed sharp edges on their metal pieces. Even the elves were quietly whispering about enchantments they planned to use later. Lyra swallowed hard. Her project looked nothing like theirs. She wondered, not for the first time, whether she had made a foolish choice. But when she looked at the bone again, its pale color, its natural curve, its quiet strength, she felt something warm inside her. She knew she wasn't ready to give up. She started by filing the edges again, making them smoother and straighter. It was slow work. Each movement of her hand had to be gentle. Bone could not be forced. It had to be persuaded. It almost felt like talking to someone shy who only opened up when treated with patience. Time passed. Hours felt like minutes. Eventually, her fingers began to ache. Her wrists felt tired. A light dust of bone covered her hands and clothes. She stood up to stretch when she heard footsteps. Approaching Dot, the instructor stopped beside her table and watched her work for a moment. "You look tired," he said. "I'm okay," she replied, wiping her hands on her apron. He examined the bone gently. "This material is testing you." "It really is," she said with a small laugh. "It doesn't want to cooperate." "It does," he corrected softly. "You just have to understand it better. Bone responds to rhythm. Not too fast, not too slow. When you find the right pace, it will follow your guidance." Lyra nodded, grateful for the advice. Before walking away, the instructor added, "Remember what we talked about. Heat will be important later. But not yet. Continue shaping first." She watched him move on to the next student, and sat back down and tried again. This time, she worked in slower, steady motions. Instead of thinking about finishing quickly, she focused on listening to the material, how it felt, how it sounded, how it reacted to her touch. Soon she noticed something surprising. When she worked gently, the bone became easier to shape. It didn't resist as much. It allowed her to guide it without cracking or splintering. She smiled a little. She was learning, but the challenge didn't end there. After several hours, she reached another difficult part, the curve near the middle of the bone. She needed to shape it into a sharper edge, but the angle made it tricky. She tried one approach, then another. One side came out uneven. She fixed it, only for the other side to look wrong. It felt like she was going in circles. Frustration prickled at her again. She put down her tools and rubbed her eyes. Maybe she needed a break. So she stepped outside into the courtyard, breathing in the cool air. A gentle breeze brushed against her face and carried faint sounds of laughter from a group of students. Sitting under a tree, she sat on the steps and watched them for a moment. Everyone seemed so confident, so comfortable. She wondered why she always had to take the harder path, why she always felt like she had to prove she belonged. But then she thought about the bone again. No one else had chosen something like it. No one else was learning what she was learning. No one else was discovering the strange joy of turning something natural into something crafted. Maybe her path wasn't harder, just different. That thought made her stand up with renewed energy. She returned to the workshop and adjusted her tools. This time, instead of forcing the curve, she worked with already existing lines in the bone. She followed the natural shape instead of fighting against it. Slowly, the curve began to form beautifully. Not sharp yet, but well-aligned and smoothed out by the afternoon, the bone had taken on a more defined shape. It was beginning to look like a blade, not a metal one, not a magical one, but something unique. Lyra could now imagine what it might look like once polished and refined. However, new problems soon appeared. As she tried to thin the edge, the bone started bending slightly. Not enough to break, but enough to make her worry. She needed to strengthen it somehow. That's when the memory of the book she read came back to her resin-infused water dot in the book. Early humans boiled bone in resin to strengthen it. She wasn't exactly sure how it worked, but decided to try. She checked the workshop storage and found a small container of tree resin used for woodworking. She asked the instructor for permission, and he allowed her to use a small pot and heating plate. She filled the pot with water, added resin, and stirred it until it dissolved. Then she gently placed the bone inside. The warm mixture filled the air with a natural, earthy smell. For the first few minutes, she watched anxiously, hoping the bone wouldn't crack or warp. Instead, something interesting happened. The bone seemed to absorb some of the mixture, becoming slightly darker and firmer. When she lifted it out carefully, it felt stronger, more solid. She smiled again, feeling a little victory lift her spirit dot. After letting it dry, she went back to shaping and filing. This time, the bone didn't resist. It felt more willing to be carved. She shaped the edges more smoothly, thinned the blade evenly, and refined the curve until it felt balanced in her hand dot at one point. An elf student walked by and stopped to watch. "That's actually looking impressive," the elf said. Lyra felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you." The elf gave a small, respectful bow before returning to her own table. By evening, Lyra's hands were sore and her arms were tired. But when she looked at the bone blade on her table, she felt a deep sense of pride. It was still unfinished rough, uneven in places, and lacking a sharpened edge, but it was real. It existed because of her effort, her patience, and her willingness to learn. She wrapped the bone again and carried it back to her dorm room. Along the way, she felt lighter than she had in days. For the first time, she could clearly see what the blade might become. In her room, she unwrapped it one more time before sleeping. She ran her fingers along its smooth surface. It felt warm now, almost alive, like it was responding to the work she had done. She whispered softly, almost laughing at herself, "We're getting there." Then she placed it beside her bed and lay down, tired but content. She had struggled, made mistakes, fixed them, learned from them, and kept going. And somewhere in her heart, she knew this was only the beginning of the real challenge. But she also knew she was ready for whatever came next. The next day, Lyra woke before sunrise. She wasn't usually an early riser, but something inside her felt restless, almost excited. The bone blade lay wrapped beside her pillow, and she touched it lightly before getting out of bed. She didn't know why, but holding it always gave her a sense of calm, like she was carrying not just an object, but the result of everything she had learned so far. The halls of the academy were quiet when she walked to the workshop. Her steps echoed softly, and for once she enjoyed the stillness. It made her feel like she had the whole place to herself. When she pushed open the workshop door, the room smelled faintly of metal, coal, and wood shavings from the previous day. She sat down at her table, unwrapped the bone blade, and looked at it under the gentle morning light. For the first time, it truly looked like something taking shape. It wasn't perfect, but it was becoming real. The curve, the smooth edges, the strengthened surface from the resin boil, everything was slowly coming together. But today was the part she had been both waiting for and fearing: heating and compressing the surface. She had read about it in the book, and the instructor hinted at it as well. Heating bone was dangerous. Too much heat could weaken it or make it crumble. But the right amount of controlled heat could make it harder, stronger, and smoother. Lyra prepared herself mentally. She gathered a small heating lamp, a pair of thick gloves, and a flat polished stone. She placed everything neatly on her table. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. After all this work, she didn't want one mistake to ruin everything. When the lamp warmed up, she held the bone blade above it, moving slowly, never stopping in one place too long. The heat gently spread across the surface, changing the color slightly. She watched carefully, looking for any signs of cracking. She whispered softly, almost as though speaking to the blade itself. Easy? Not too much. Her voice sounded silly even to her, but somehow it helped. It made her movements calmer, her mind more focused. Minutes passed. She flipped the bone gently, warming the other side. When it felt ready, she placed it on the table, picked up the polished stone, and pressed down with steady pressure. A soft creaking noise came from the bone. She paused, heart pounding. Was it cracking? She lifted the stone slowly. To her relief, the bone was unharmed, only slightly smoother. As intended, she exhaled deeply. The process needed to be repeated over and over, inch by inch, until the entire blade was compressed. It was slow, tiring work. Sweat formed on her forehead, even though the room was cool. Her arms ached from keeping the pressure steady. But every time she lifted the polished stone and saw the surface becoming more refined, she felt a quiet pride settle into her chest at around mid-morning, the workshop filled with students. Hammers clanged, flames roared, magic glowed faintly in the elf corner. The usual noise returned. Some students glanced at Lyra, curious about what she was doing with a heated stone and a bone blade. A few whispered, but she didn't pay them much attention. She had found her rhythm, just as the instructor said, steady, patient, focused. While she worked, the instructor walked by and stopped to observe. He didn't interrupt her. He simply watched the methodical way she heated, pressed, and examined the bone. When she finished a section and put down the stone, he finally spoke. "You're doing it correctly," he said. She smiled slightly. "It's harder than I thought it would be." "It usually is," he replied. "But you're learning to listen to the material. That's something many students never understand." His words warmed her. She didn't need praise, but hearing that she was on the right track gave her new strength. After he left, she continued working. Slowly, the bone blade became firmer, smoother, and more refined. She could feel the difference when she held it. The blade felt more solid, less fragile, almost as if it had grown a backbone. Around noon, she took a break and sat outside under a tree. She ate a small meal while staring at the sky, letting her tired muscles relax. When a few students walked past her, two of them stopped. One of them, a dwarf student, said, "I saw your blade earlier." "Bone, right?" Lyra nodded, unsure what to expect. The dwarf scratched his beard and added, "It looks stronger than I expected. You're doing something right." The other student, a beast folk with soft fur around his ears, nodded as well. "It's different, but different can be good." Lyra felt a small wave of relief. Even though others had teased her before, now some were beginning to see the effort behind her choice. After her break, she returned to her station. She still had polishing and fine shaping to do. She picked up a small scraper and began smoothing the edges little by little. Bone dust floated gently into the air as she worked. At one point, she set the blade on her lap and just looked at it. The shape had become beautiful in its own way, soft curves, mixed with sharp angles, pale color with faint patterns that almost looked like natural markings. She realized something then. This blade didn't need to look like anyone else's. It didn't need magic or metal to be special. It only needed to show her effort. She placed it back on the table and continued later in the afternoon. She decided to test it not by cutting anything dangerous, but simply by pressing the edge gently against a piece of wood. She didn't expect much. She just wanted to know if she was on the right path. To her surprise, the bone edge actually dug into the wood slightly. Not deeply, but enough to leave a clean line. She blinked, startled. It worked. She tested again, just a little. The blade responded the same way. She wasn't using force, only gentle pressure, but the bone had become sharp enough to leave marks. That small success made her chest feel warm and full, like she was holding a secret victory in her hands. An elf student nearby noticed and walked over quietly. "Did it just cut the wood?" the elf asked. "A little," Lyra admitted shyly. The elf studied the blade with new respect. Bone shouldn't cut that smoothly unless the shaping was done well. Lyra shrugged lightly. "I guess I'm learning faster than I thought." "You're doing more than learning," the elf said. "You're creating something unusual." After the elf walked away, Lyra couldn't help smiling. The rest of the afternoon passed in quiet determination. She tightened the handle area, shaped a small grip, and cleaned the surface again and again until the bone felt almost silky. Even the instructor, during his final round of checking, paused longer than usual at her table. When the workshop closed for the day, everyone packed their materials. Lyra wrapped the bone blade gently, holding it with both hands as she walked through the evening courtyard. The setting sun cast a warm glow over everything, and the sky looked soft and golden. She sat on a bench for a moment and unwrapped the blade again. The sunlight touched its surface, making it shine faintly in a gentle, natural way. Not like metal, not like magic, but like something handcrafted with patience and heart. She thought back to the first day she found the bone in the forest. How uncertain she had been. How everyone had doubted her. How she had doubted herself. And yet, here she was, holding something real, something beautiful, that she had shaped with her own hands. In that moment, she felt calm, proud, and strangely connected to the material she had chosen. It was almost like the blade held a piece of her journey within it. She whispered softly, "You're turning out better than I hoped." And she wrapped it carefully and headed back to her room. Her arms were tired, her fingers ached, and her clothes were covered in a thin layer of bone dust. But her heart felt lighter than it had in a long time. She knew tomorrow would bring the next challenge, sharpening and final testing. But now, for the first time, she believed she had a real chance. She believed she could finish what she started. And as she fell asleep that night, the bone blade resting beside her, she felt a quiet excitement growing inside her, because she knew the real transformation was about to begin. When the day of the final test finally arrived, the whole academy felt different. The open yard where students normally trained was filled with long tables, wooden targets, stone blocks, and racks of tools. Everyone had been preparing for weeks, and the air carried a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Students from other classes wandered around to watch, whispering and pointing at the unusual shapes and bright colors of the different blades. The girl walked into the yard, carrying her bone blade wrapped in cloth. Her hands were steady, but inside her chest, her heart felt like it was tapping softly against her ribs. She had spent so many long nights working on this strange project that it almost felt unreal to finally stand among all the others. Around her, students from different races held weapons crafted from metal, crystal, enchanted ore, and even rare stones that glowed faintly from magic. Some looked proud, others looked unsure. A tall elf student stood polishing his silver blade. It shimmered like moonlight and had delicate patterns that seemed to ripple when he moved. A dwarf student tested the weight of his thick iron blade, nodding in satisfaction each time it made a low hum when swung through the air. Two orc students compared the sharpness of their heavy, wide-edged blades, grinning as they teased each other. Their weapons looked like they could cut a log clean in half. When the girl passed by, some students gave her curious glances. They had been watching her quiet, lonely work for weeks, and almost all of them had guessed she would bring something unusual. A few whispered among themselves, wondering what she could possibly have made with only a piece of bone, no magic, and no fancy tools. But no one said anything out loud this time. The laughter and mockery she once heard had faded away, replaced by a strange kind of interest. She found a small empty place on a workbench at the side of the yard and carefully unwrapped the cloth. For a moment, the bone blade seemed to glow softly in the morning light. Its smooth curve, pale surface, and polished shine made it look almost like a piece of art rather than a weapon. She touched the hilt, remembering all the small failures, the cuts on her fingers, the long nights of carving and reshaping. Each mark had been worth it. Her instructor slowly walked into the center of the yard. He carried a board with all the students' names listed. He had taught generations of students, and nothing much surprised him anymore. But even he paused when his eyes fell on her blade. It was something not often seen, crafted with patience and old methods that most had forgotten. He raised a hand, and the yard went silent. "Today," he said, "you will show not only your skill, but your understanding. A blade is not only a tool, it is an expression of effort, choices, and discipline." The tests were divided into rounds. Each student would go through them one at a time, while the others watched. The first round was the sharpness test. Wooden blocks, rope bundles, and layers of fabric were arranged on a long table. The elf went first, slicing through everything with smooth, graceful movements. His blade left clean lines, and the crowd murmured with approval. The dwarf followed, swinging his heavy blade with strength. Though it wasn't smooth like the elf's cuts, his blade's power was undeniable. The orc students impressed everyone with the raw force behind their swings, chopping through thick rope bundles as if they were nothing more than grass. One by one, students stepped up. Some did well, others struggled. A few blades turned out to be too brittle, cracking slightly during the test. Others were sharp but lacked balance, making them difficult to control. Then it was her turn. She stepped forward, holding her bone blade with both hands. For a moment, everything went quiet. She had no magical glow, no sparkling metal, no heavy weight behind her swing. All she had was weeks of work and a material that everyone else believed was too weak to compete. She took a steady breath and started with the rope. Her blade slipped through it smoothly, almost silently. Some students blinked in surprise. Next, she moved to the layered fabric. She sliced down once, and the layers fell apart cleanly. The instructor's eyebrows lifted slightly. Finally, she stood before the wooden block. She hesitated not out of fear, but because wood was the real test. If her blade was going to fail, it would happen here. She tightened her grip and swung. The blade cut a clear, even line into the wood. Not deep like the metal blades, but straight and controlled. When she lifted the blade, the edge was still perfectly intact. A soft wave of whispering spread through the yard. It wasn't loud or mocking, just quiet surprise. The second round was the durability test. Students had to tap their blades against a stone block to show the strength of the edge. Many were nervous, as too much force could chip the blade. The elf tapped lightly, protecting his delicate edge. The dwarf struck with bold confidence, leaving only a small mark. The orc students hit so hard, their instructor had to remind them not to break the stone. When her turn came, she held her breath. Bone could chip, she knew that. But she had boiled it in resin, pressed it under heat, and polished it until every small crack was sealed. She raised the blade and tapped the stone, not too hard, not too light. A soft clicking sound echoed. She examined the edge. It stayed smooth, Dot. Her instructor inspected it as well. Unexpected, he said softly. Not disbelief, more like admiration. The final round was the control test. Students had to carve a small pattern into a wooden block, showing how steady and precise they could be. This test was difficult, even for those with metal blades. Many students struggled. Some carved crooked lines, others cut too deep. A few rushed and made messy shapes. When she stepped forward, she felt her nerves rise again. This test wasn't about strength or cutting power. It was about patience, and that was the one thing she had practiced the most. She placed the wooden block on the table, held her blade gently, and slowly ran the edge along the surface. The bone blade glided carefully, carving a thin, elegant line. Then another. Then a curved shape. Her hands were steady, her breathing calm. She didn't rush. She didn't try to impress. She simply let her blade move the way she had practiced night after night. When she stepped back, a simple but pleasing pattern lay carved on the block, a small flowing design that looked like a wave. The yard was silent for a moment, not because the carving was perfect or magical, but because it carried a quiet beauty that came purely from effort and patience. The instructor walked toward her. You've shown something many forget, he said. Skill isn't only in the material, it's in the maker. He wrote her score on the board, and for the first time since the tests began, the crowd reacted with real appreciation. A few students nodded at her respectfully. Others looked at her blade with new interest. The same orc who once laughed at her bone blade stepped closer and said, That's different. Good different. She smiled, a small but genuine smile, and wrapped her blade again. For the first time since the assignment started, she felt light both in her heart and her steps. She hadn't tried to outshine anyone. She hadn't tried to make the strongest or most magical blade. She had simply worked with what she had, trusted her process, and created something that felt true to her. Dot as the students left the yard. Talking about each other's blades and the unexpected results, she walked quietly toward her usual path. She didn't need to brag or show off. Her blade had spoken for her, and she knew deep inside that this was only the beginning of her real journey. After the exam ended, the girl expected things to return to normal. She thought the other students would go back to their own projects, their own friend groups, their own busy lives. She carried her bone blade wrapped in cloth, holding it close like something fragile and personal. To her, it wasn't just a tool or a project. It was a quiet story of everything she went through: late nights, doubts, patience, and small victories. But something had changed. When she walked through the academy halls the next day, people didn't ignore her the way they used to. They didn't laugh behind her back or whisper things that made her want to hide. Instead, they watched her with small smiles or curious eyes. Some nodded politely. A few even moved aside to give her room. It wasn't fame, and she didn't suddenly become popular, but there was a new sense of respect in the air, the kind that comes slowly and quietly. One student approached her near the courtyard. He was taller than her, and usually very competitive. Before the exam, he had made comments about how a bone blade could never match metal. But now he cleared his throat and said, I saw how your blade held up yesterday. How did you keep it from cracking during the shaping? She was surprised by his question, but she explained simply how she boiled the bone in resin water, how she slowly pressed it under heat, and how she shaped the curve over many days without rushing. The boy listened seriously and even thanked her before walking away. This small moment made her smile, not because she wanted praise, but because someone had actually cared enough to ask how she did at Dot later that week, while she sat on the grass behind the workshop building during her lunch break. A group of younger students came running toward her. They stopped a few steps away, shy and unsure. One of them, A short kid with wide eyes held out a tiny wooden carving. We tried. We tried making designs like yours, the kid mumbled. But ours don't look nice. Could you show us how to hold the tool? She looked at the little carving. The lines were shaky and uneven, but she could see the effort behind them. She nodded gently and showed them how to angle the tool, how not to press too hard, and how to let the blade glide instead of forcing it. The kids watched closely, copying her movements with excitement. When they left, they waved happily at her. She waved back, feeling warm inside. Over the next few days, things continued to change in small but meaningful ways. Some students came to her with questions about materials. Others wanted to know how she handled mistakes without giving up. She didn't see herself as someone special. She was just a girl who had worked hard on a strange idea. But the academy now saw her differently, not as the weakest one, not as the one who didn't belong, but as someone who could surprise them. The instructor who had led the exam called her to the workshop one afternoon. She walked in and saw him standing beside a wooden table with many tools arranged neatly. He looked at her with calm eyes full of quiet pride. "You've done something unusual," he said, "not just by making a blade from bone, but by reminding your classmates that skill can come from patience, not power." She lowered her gaze. Unsure what to say, the instructor placed a small wooden box on the table. "I want you to have this," he said. She opened it carefully. Inside was a set of fine carving tools, old but well kept. The handles were smooth, and the metal edges gleamed softly. "These were mine when I was young," the instructor said. "I used them to learn how to shape material. They helped me grow. And I believe they will help you too." She felt her throat tighten a little. It was the kind of gift someone only gave when they truly believed in you. She bowed her head and whispered a thank you. As weeks passed, her confidence grew. She kept practicing with the bone blade, but she also tried new materials, wood, clay, and even soft metal when she finally felt brave enough. She didn't try to compete with the others. She simply enjoyed learning. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she belonged at the academy. But the biggest surprise came when someone from another class approached her near the main gate. He wore the uniform of a senior student and carried a carved wooden staff. He had heard about her bone blade and wanted to see it for himself. She hesitated, but eventually unwrapped it. He studied it closely, turning it in his hands, checking the balance, the curve, the smoothness. "This is impressive," he said softly. "You have an eye for detail. Not many students your age do." She didn't know how to respond, so she just smiled. He handed it back and said, "There's a small group that meets once a week to share new crafting ideas. We usually work with rare materials, but I think your approach would bring something fresh. You should come if you want." At first, she wasn't sure. A group of older students sounded intimidating, but curiosity slowly grew inside her. She finally decided to attend one session just to see what it was like. When she arrived, they welcomed her warmly. The room smelled of wood dust and warm metal. Everyone sat around a large table, sharing their projects. Some were working on mechanical tools. Others were shaping magical stones. When her turn came, she showed her bone blade. Instead of laughing, they leaned closer, asking questions about its shape, strength, and the process she had used. She realized something important that day. Her blade wasn't strange anymore. It wasn't a joke or a desperate attempt at passing an exam. It had become something people wanted to learn from. Something unique. Something worth talking about. She continued attending the group meetings regularly. She learned new techniques, heard new ideas, and even taught a few things of her own. She began to understand that crafting wasn't about having the strongest material or the best tools. It was about thinking differently, being patient, and trusting your own hands. Eventually, word of her blade spread farther than she expected. Students from other departments came to look at it. Some teachers mentioned her work during lessons about creativity. Even the academy librarian placed a small note in one of the old crafting books, mentioning her method for strengthening bone, something the next generation of students might read someday. One afternoon, while she sat outside polishing the blade, she thought about how everything had changed. She remembered the first day of the assignment, when she had felt lost and unsure. She remembered the laughter, the doubts, the moments when she almost gave up. And now she sat in the warm sun, surrounded by people who respected her craft. With new tools and new confidence. She didn't become famous. She didn't become the strongest or the fastest or the most talented student. But she had done something meaningful. She had discovered her own path, one shaped by effort rather than shortcuts. The bone blade remained with her, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of patience. Whenever she touched its smooth surface, she felt calm. It reminded her that sometimes the simplest material, handled with care and heart, can become something extraordinary. Years later, when she looked back on her time at the academy, she didn't remember the pressure of the final exam or the fear of failure. What she remembered most were the quiet moments, the nights spent working alone, the soft glow of the workshop lamps, the first time she carved a clean line, the smiles of younger students, and the warm pride in her instructor's eyes. The blade had started as just a piece of bone, but through her hands, it had become something much more. It became a story, a story of quiet strength, steady hands, and the courage to listen to her own ideas, even when others didn't understand. And that story stayed with her for the rest of her life, always reminding her that even from simple beginnings, something beautiful can be shaped.